Let's see. Hey, Mark, how are you? I don't know if you can see me, but I can see you. I'm going to try to look at you while looking at this great audience. Terrific to have you. I think they've set us up to have the most depressing session in this as we talk about the state of the world. Mark, you were just recently in Ukraine, and I want to tell people that Mark Green, while he's is president of the Wilson Center, is a former member of Congress, former head of the International Republic Institute, very, very involved with the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. He's been looking for years from lots of different parts of the sandbox of the world's stress points, right? Those fragment points. And if you really want to screw up a wedding someday and give a toast for the bride or groom or the happy married couple, you can use a Jeremy Bentham line that I always use, and kind of turns people off, that happiness is a function of relative deprivation. And when you kind of look at that and you kind of bring this in and look at the world, one of the things when you get beyond the very top level within the Gallup report, you see some places that you thought would be tough with an astounding level of happiness. And some of the richest places in the world fall very low on that list. And Mark, I'd like to ask you, as you think about the way we frame it, we're sort of a digital world now. We're looking at numbers and comparisons. But if we were to put you in charge of happiness in Ukraine, happiness in Eastern Europe, happiness in Africa, all of which you know well, what would be the framing points, the sort of nodes we would have to think about more seriously than we are today to get things right?
Well, I think certainly when it comes to political leaders and how they should approach this, it's simply listening. Leaders may hear what, for example, young people are saying, but they rarely spend time actually listening to them and trying to incorporate their aspirations and desires and needs in policy. So that really is what I think it's all about. It isn't so much happiness as the right to pursue happiness, the right to chase your dreams, the right to try to provide for your family, to try to pursue those opportunities that you think about. And that's what we're not seeing enough of these days. Even in a time when technology, frugal technology, has been more available than ever before, there are too many occasions where we're not seeing leaders listening to young people and trying to find ways to open up that technology to them.
You just were in Ukraine. Give us a snapshot there. And I want to be honest with people that there are stories that are very, very tough to hear and complicated. Yesterday morning, I hosted an event on Ukraine and looking at relative degrees of confidence in whether they would prevail, what was driving them. And in every category that this fascinating woman and person, and the data that she had, which seemed very solid, is there's been a decrease in confidence, a decrease in all of those issues that if you were to amalgamate them would be their relative level of happiness. And that since this report was done. What was your on-the-ground takeaways from Ukraine?
Well, first off, the resilience of the Ukrainian people is remarkable. They have withstood all kinds of bombardment, daily bombardment from the Kremlin, and yet they continue to push forward. The phrase that we heard over and over again from their leaders, but also from everyday Ukrainians, they said, when you go back to the States, tell Americans that we are tired but not exhausted. So they recognize that this has been a burden for some time, but they also recognize that it's a fight for their very survival. So there is this sort of defiance and resilience in their everyday activities. Well, one thing I'll say, what is truly remarkable is, even when that missile strike occurs in an apartment building or a home, within hours, they're seeking to rebuild. And so Kyiv was the last place that we visited. It was a 1,300-mile journey around Ukraine. Kyiv was the last place. A missile hit an apartment building. We wanted to rush there and see it. By the time we got there, not 36 hours after the strike, they were already up repairing and rebuilding. So there is a resilience there. The other thing I would say is that they're listening to every word that occurs inside the Beltway back here in D.C., and that is a deep concern. They're worried. I was asked openly over and over again, they're worried that America might not be with them for the long run. And I told them I thought we would be, but you could see that that's really weighing upon them. And then the third takeaway that I have is that Ukrainians, Moldovans, Poles, we also went through Warsaw, they see this differently than we do. We see this as a bilateral conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and they view this as multilateral. They view this as dictatorship on the march. And so they're worried not simply about those areas impacted directly in Ukraine in the fighting, but what's taking place in neighboring countries and throughout the region.
You know, Mark, I'm not sure I'm going to get this question right, so hang with me, folks. But it's something I've been thinking about with regards. I've interviewed Jim Clifton and John Clifton and tried to think about how to bring some of this back to a reality and attraction in the world that matters. And one of the things that seems different, I'm a history buff, as you know, I just wonder whether there's an enthusiasm inside America, among Americans, to try to do good in the world, to try to empathize with those others. And I would go to Europe, I would say the same thing. Is there something happening around the world where our empathy is becoming brittle, and the muscles that we used to have to be engaged with the world problems, which actually is part of the happiness equation, right? To kind of get a greater level of contentment that the future will somehow be better than the past if we work on it. Is that dying?
Yeah, I don't know if that's dying as much as I think Americans are sort of suffering from information overload. You know, they turn on TV at night to the extent they still watch TV over dinner, and they look and they see fighting in Ukraine, they see fighting in Israel, Gaza, and they see what's happening in Haiti, and it's too much. It overwhelms them, and I think they find it difficult to process. And I think it impacts, in their mind, our ability to make a marked difference in terms of shaping world events. So I think it's a little bit of weariness as much as anything. And I think it's a sense that there are larger forces at play than perhaps we have the ability to shape. I would disagree with that. I do think that we have the world's most important role. We are the leader of the free world, but there is an overwhelming sense of weariness, I think.
You know, you have I don't know if any of you, all of you know about the Wilson Center, but they've got, direct programs. They're often regional programs. They have transnational programs on climate. Mark, you've done a lot in Africa, but you also have fellows that come in, for a limited period of time. And I've always wondered, today, if you don't know, this room is packed to the gills, and I don't think it's just because of the good coffee, but the room is very, very full with people who are interested in this subject. Do you believe that the ingredients from this report of looking at what may be a higher density of what we would call happiness in some parts of the country is worth more policy study? Should we have Wilson Center activity, scholars coming in saying, what are some of these countries getting right, and what are other countries able to learn? Is there a best and promising practices arena in policy happiness, if you will?
So I think there is. So I'll say this. I think sometimes we get caught up in data and information, and we don't spend as much time on knowledge and learning. And I think it's helping to process what the report points to and put it to work in terms of shaping policy. Again, to me, it goes back to something very simple. We need leaders who will pause for a moment and actually listen to constituents and listen to young people. I come from, as you know, Steve, I come from a part of the country that's often flyover country back in Green Bay, Wisconsin. The sense back there is that people are not listening, that they have some ideas and yet their leaders aren't listening. So I think it's going back to listening, and I think that's really what the data points to. And that very simple construct, I think that to me is the big takeaway from this report.
How does economic development fit in, Mark? One of the things that's also on my mind is April 7th, if you folks haven't followed, is the 30th anniversary of the genocide in Rwanda. And I have watched Rwanda try to, it's a small country, about 8 million people in the middle of a much larger continent, but looking at the kind of practices you put in place to get trust reestablished, people to accept back and reassimilate those who caused lots of pain in the past, but then to trust each other enough. I mean, we've dealt with companies like Verizon and MasterCard, not to be nice to the sponsors here today, but who are looking at how do you get the next billion people connected to an infrastructure of both financial and communications connectedness. So human connectivity is a really important part of this. But from when it comes to some of the things we're struggling with today, which is how do you get contentment, happiness, national well-being higher, how do you think the economic portion of that should be baked in?
Well, I'll say this. So trade and commerce have somehow become dirty words and difficult political terms in today's
particularly
debates.
In your former party or your party.
I think it's a profound mistake because I think those everyday economic relationships, the give and take, the in the African context, arguing with the ladies in the marketplace over the price of vegetables. It's not so much about the price of vegetables, it's the human interaction where each person goes into that discussion bringing something to share. We don't spend enough time with the give and take of economic relationships, and that really is what we have to get back to, because that's what binds communities, that's what binds nations, that's what binds the world. Each goes into that conversation with something of value to share. So it isn't, to me, the technologies that you're referencing, those can be the tools, those can be the accelerants in the interaction. But if we don't get back to the basics and talking about the value of human dignity and human interaction, what's the purpose of the technology? What does it really deliver?
One of the other measures, Mark, now in the world, and I'm sure it's been discussed this morning, is that the number of refugees, of desperate migrants, of displaced persons has never been higher in modern history. Never been higher. It is at a top. You go back to World War II, you go back to World War I, it has never been as bad globally as it is today. And so when I look at that and I ask myself, okay, how do we think about that? I don't know. I don't want to ask, some silly thing, what's the silver bullet solution? I am interested in the scars that leaves in societies. And I'm worried about, I don't know what to call it, a kind of large aggregated social PTSD, the victims of this moment. And as we look forward, that is what I'm going to be talking to Senator Chris Murphy in a moment, about loneliness, the disconnectedness between people. But I think there's a global dimension of people feeling left behind, demeaned, not connected, and not cared about. And I'm just wondering, as as a smart policy person that has played in a lot of this arena, do we need to come together as nations and organizers to begin anticipating how we deal with those scars?
You pointed to something I think terribly important. So there are 110 million displaced people in the world. People are not where they were and not where they're going to be. And they're largely stateless. 1 million children were born in refugee camps in the last 2 years. And the average stay of a displaced person in that setting is 14, 15 years and growing. And so, God willing, the fence comes down, the gate open, whatever imagery you want to use, how are those people not among the most vulnerable people in the entire world? They've been cut off and isolated, and they're vulnerable, and I think the seeds of great risk. So I think we need to understand that many of the people who are displaced they of course are of value, but they have potential. We have to find ways of tapping into that potential, providing job training and skills and interaction. And that's what the technology can do. Henrietta Fore, former head of UNICEF and a good friend, she talks about calling a national mission for connecting every refugee camp in the world to the internet, just to create that sense of interaction and the ties that bind. And I think it really is something for us to be looking at, not treating people as commodities, not treating people as sort of pieces on a game board, but recognizing that these are people of worth, of value, of potential. For their sake and for our sake, we need to do a much better job of reaching out and connecting with them, because otherwise these numbers, growing by the day, will truly be overwhelming to any sense of stability in the world.
Mark, real quick, last question. Do you think I mean, I'm focused on the United States for a minute, Americans, maybe in Washington, D.C., honestly, in this little bubble here of, cocktail parties and great events. Are we, as we speak about these things, a little bit too buffered from the pain that's out there in the world? Should we be proactively doing things to shock ourselves a little bit to understand because I am interested in the kind of dismal, vapid dimensions of empathy in this town. And I'm wondering, are there things that we should be trying to do to change that?
Well, a call for national service. I think every American should take on the mission of serving somewhere in this country, somewhere in this world, and humanizing these numbers. As you referenced, I used to lead USAID, and whether it be going into that IDP camp in Burma and looking at a young Rohingya father in the eye, all of his kids were born in that camp, and he's never been given permission to leave. And there is a hopelessness and a despair there to, the Venezuelans that I met in the border between Venezuela and Colombia, who are looking for something that would connect them to the outer world, some hopefulness and economic opportunity. It's hard to look those people in the eye and not be shaken and not be rattled and not have a sense of where we as a people are falling short and what it is that we should be doing.
So, Mark, over your left shoulder, it says Wilson Center. Is that the new brand?
Well, it's the brand. I don't know how new it is, but it is the brand.
So I want to remind people, maybe I just know it for a long time, but I want people to know this. The Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars and the international work and platform that you folks do is so important to bring those people in town. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a round of applause to Ambassador Mark Green. Thank you so much, Mark.
Thank you. Great to be with you.